Welcome to Hunters and Unicorns. I'm Simon Kutis and I'm joined by my co-host Ollie Kune.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the show.
And it's an absolute pleasure to be joined by Chris Singletary. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks, guys. I'm really happy to be here.
Great to have you on the show today, Chris. Known and been speaking for a long time, so it's been a long time coming, this opportunity to get you on the show. So really do appreciate you taking time out of that busy schedule of yours and joining us here today.
No, it's been great to get to know both of you and have the conversations that we had in preparation, and I'm looking forward to today.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, by way of an introduction, Chris, you're currently RVP-East at Coralogix. And it's been a very interesting career because you've literally followed the playbook at the various stages of its evolution. And I think what's really exciting about the story we're going to share today, Chris, is that your career started back at PTC, where you had your first exposure to the playbook, and you've literally followed it all the way through to the modern day. So we're really going to get a real kind of insight into how the playbook has really evolved at the various organizations, companies like PTC, BMC, Opsware, AppDynamics, Lacework, and currently at Coralogix. So really excited to hear your story. Chris, just take us right to the beginning. How did it all begin? How did you first get into software sales?
Yeah, well, when you graduate from college in Alabama and you need to get a job really quickly, at that time, sales wasn't quite the career it is today. And if you had a pulse and you had a little fire and energy, you for the most part were going to get an opportunity. And my boss at PTC at the time, Mike Logan, who I'm still friends with today, and it's a great guy, great person, gave me that opportunity. And little did I know the kind of impact that it was going to have, not only on me personally, but professionally as well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it was a bit of a baptism of fire. Obviously, getting straight into one of the most elite and one of the most hardcore sales organizations. Obviously, you joined from the military because your background was actually you joined the military, which really set you up for what was quite a baptism of fire, I suppose, is the best way to really describe it. So just take us right to the beginning, Chris. What were the early days like, and what were your expectations back then, and what were your first experiences?
Kind of a short answer is you had an opportunity. You were on a 90-day contract. 90-day contract, you either sold or you got fired. And I think there are a lot of stories about that. I don't know that would go over quite as well today. But the nice thing about it is that every person in the organization was under the same, expectations, had the same expectations, under the same types of pressure, and from your manager to your manager's manager. And that created kind of I would say a little bit of a camaraderie and a bonding experience, because we all knew what was necessary, and we did what we had to do to make it happen. But to answer your question specifically, it was about revenue, and it was about making the number, and there really wasn't an opportunity for failure.
Sure. We've obviously heard a lot about these stories of old, these old hardcore sales environments. But I suppose if you were to really compare it, bringing it to the modern day, in terms of what you experienced then and what you're experiencing now, how much of that has changed and how much of it is still relevant today in terms of what you see?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I probably have a little bit of a different perspective on it. Personally, I think the expectations are very similar. The biggest difference is they're not articulated in the same way that they were when I first got started. It was very frank and direct conversation, when I first got started. And now it's crafted in terms of, expectations that are documented, one-on-one conversations that happen. follow-up email that happens. It's just less frank and direct, Simon. That seems to be the biggest difference. And having said that, there is a little more latitude. I think 90 days is not really an expectation that I think an organization should have for a ramp of a new individual. It's really more about 6 to 9 months, and it's about getting ahead of issues or potential problems or difficulty in ramp early.
Yeah. What's interesting is that obviously you've been part of this community, this Playbook community, right from when it formed. You've been at organisations like PTC. You were then at BMC, AppDynamics, Lacework. In terms of the actual playbook itself, Chris, what are your experiences and how was it communicated and articulated to you back then, compared to how is it kind of being used today, and just kind of take us there.
Yeah, I think also one of the things that I have noticed, or maybe the right way to describe it is how it's evolved.
Yeah.
Right. I think early on at PTC, I mean, if you remember, John McMahon was still the VP of Sales. Kaplan was still a manager. Grant Wilson, who we all know from Force Management, was still there. I was fortunate enough, like I said, to work for Mike and great leaders like Cindy Skak and John Garrison, Terry Powers, Rob Chapdelaine. Everyone took their motivation and their, and how to go about their job day to day from John. And I think at the time I didn't appreciate it, right? Now I do, all these years later. But, one of the things I always thought was interesting about John was that he never asked you to do anything, or his leaders. I didn't obviously work for him at the time. I was a rep in Birmingham working for Mike Logan. But he never asked any of his team to do anything that he wasn't not just capable of doing, but probably was the best at, right? And a lot of these concepts and ideas came from him. And then as it trickled down into the field, the managers and the different leaders all contributed their experiences, things like MEDIC, right? That was the first time I ever heard the term MEDIC was back at PTC, right? Metrics, the economic buyer, the decision process, criteria, pain, and a champion. And that's where it was really ingrained in me that you had to find pain, but none of this stuff was documented. I think that's what's interesting, versus what we have today. At the time, this was all conceptual. This was all discussed. We were always in the field. These were things that we would talk about. This is actually when you would get in the car and drive to your territory. Selling PTC, it was CAD CAM, right? We were selling, to manufacturing places that were out, in the middle of nowhere in West Alabama. And so we had all these conversations going and coming around all of these concepts. I think that was the thing that I found most interesting, Simon, at the time, was it was just being formalized. And then, of course, now everything is documented, right? Yeah. MedPIC has evolved. The value framework has evolved. Force management has evolved. All of this documentation that I think sometimes, people interpret as being almost too literal and too prescriptive, and miss sometimes the concepts behind the framework.
Yeah, sure. It's really interesting reflecting on what you're sharing, because we've been recording this series now for a number of years, and obviously a lot of our listeners and our viewers, they take a lot of value from listening to these stories. But it's easy for there to be a disconnect between the legends of old, right? And back in our day, this is how we used to do it. And I think what's really interesting about your case, Chris, is that you're still actually very hands-on to this day. Unlike many of the legends that we've had on the show. I suppose what's really interesting about your situation is that you've still got that hunger, you've still got that desire, you still roll up the sleeves, and there are some very specific things that you continue to do to this day that have really helped you, from that past. And I suppose one of the core things is around top of the funnel activity. So just talk to us a little bit about the foundations of what what that were laid previously and how you're applying those principles and perhaps what you're doing differently now.
Yeah. I mean, I think at the time, early on, prospecting it was very, very different, right? I mean, it was all phone work. It was, calling decision makers, going through switchboards, that was one of the toughest things, gatekeeper. We don't really hear that term anymore, right? And I think I'm dating myself a little bit, but I'm trying to, convey the point here, right? Today, with all the information as freely available as it is, with products as freely available as they are, downloads, et cetera, tech evolution with cloud and now with SaaS software, and just again, how much buyers can become educated without the help of the salesperson. I think that is something that I think gets lost is really what is the challenge in prospecting today, right? The buyers, we're in a SaaS world where it's, there are 12-month contracts. It's not a situation where people are making 10-year, decisions, perpetual software in the data center. We're constantly selling, and there are hundreds, literally thousands of vendors and SDRs and AEs calling these same accounts. And that's the challenge. It's like, how do you differentiate? How do you stand out in a sea of hundreds and thousands? And I think it comes down to how you approach PG. And what I mean by that is, we get people on the phone and we sound exactly like everyone else. We're making a pitch, right? It's the same pitch over and over again, vendor to vendor, and it's a complete turnoff to the person on the other end of the line, right? That connect is super valuable. That's the one thing that we don't quite have full control over, is actually getting the connect. What we do have control over is what happens when we make it. How do we differentiate? And I find so many times reps are making that same, I'll say, almost monotone robotic pitch that sounds just like everyone else. Fast, efficient, cost-effective, right? You're not differentiating. So how do you do that? It really comes down to the research up front and building a legitimate PG plan. And what I mean by that, right? It's like, do you understand your ICP? Do you understand where you have the most success? Do you understand where you've been successful before? Do you understand the personas, right? Do you understand the cloud, the tech fit, the tech stack, the competition? That's a lot of information, right, for a rep to research and to build, and then be able to then build a hypothesis, right, around what is going to be my message, right? And I think that's something that is very difficult today. And a place where I spend a lot of my time is building a legitimate and a PG plan where you can be consistent, you can be prescriptive, and can have sustained success, right? And one of the things that is differentiated is when you know more about that customer than they know about themselves, potentially, and you at least know more than the other 100 reps that they spoke to in the previous week. It's less about your pitch and it's more about making a connection and showing that you invested in that person, in that company, in that persona, and you actually can identify them and the challenges that they have each and every day. That's a way to differentiate. This isn't rocket science. It's not something that I came up with, but it's something that's very difficult to put into practice. And to me, that's where I see the difference between being great and being mediocre. Personally, I don't think there's good. It's that you're either satisfactory or you're mediocre and you're just like the other reps, or you understand, what it takes to get in front of an account and be different from the other salespeople. You haven't even had the opportunity to differentiate your product because you don't have credibility, right? And I think this is conceptually where reps that are very successful, they understand this and they start to develop these behaviors and put it into practice. And that's really one of my main focuses. And it has been as of late in my career and definitely is today at Coralogix.
Chris, help us unpack that a little bit. So to break that down into, your research and what areas you're researching on a customer and how you coach your reps to research, what are the key things you're going after?
Great question. I think, all of these tools, and I'll say this technographic information is available to organizations, right? Whether it's free information or whether it's subscribed to, But for us, as an example, right, it's evolving, but we have a pretty good understanding of what our ICP is, where we can put ourselves in the best position to be successful. And, for us, we use sources like Crunchbase as an example to understand the accounts inside of our territory is one example, right? We leverage ZoomInfo and Sales Navigator to help build out not just the personas, but who were those contacts that fit those personas inside of our target accounts, right? And then we leverage, information like Intricately as an example, as another tool that we use, right? We gain information around what clouds are they in, right? What is their tech stack inside of the cloud? Did they just go through a lift and shift, or are they, a little bit more mature in their modernization effort? Or were they born in the cloud, right? Some software companies have been around for a while and they're evolving. Some are brand, are new, less than 6, 8, 10 years old, right? So do they have Kubernetes? Do they still have VMs? That's a big swing, but that's the point that I'm trying to make. Do you understand the tech stack? Do you understand the competition? If you know those things, that based on what your product does and the value that provide, you can build a pretty good hypothesis. Right? We understand the pain that we solve. We're looking for the characteristics in these accounts that say to us, hey, this company has the problems that we solve, and if we'll have an opportunity to be successful here, we just have to break in and have a conversation with the right person.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I think again, whilst we've got you here with us today, Chris, help us understand that now that you've got all of these different platforms and sources to be able to identify this information, take us back to the early stages of PTC or even BMC, probably when these tools didn't exist. Where were you obtaining this information, and how were you able to do that? Because this part of the playbook has existed since day one, but back then it surely couldn't have been as easy, and information was not as freely available as it is today, right?
That's correct. I'm gonna throw out some terms that some of your listeners may not have heard before. And it's called hot knocking. It's called foot canvassing. It's called physical prospecting, knocking on doors after 5 p.m. when the person that's, I'll say the administrative assistant that's guarding the entrance to the building has already gone home, right? I think I may have told you the story. One of the best cold calls I ever had, we were actually doing a sales call across the street at a manufacturing company called Emerson Electric, right? They basically built radiant heat elements. The company across the street was a Dover company. They built trash compactors, right? And it was late in the day. We had been at Emerson for several hours doing a POC, and I'm with Mike, and I, frankly, if it not for Mike, I might not have done it but he was always, he practiced what he preached. He goes, you think anyone's still over there? And it's like 5:30, 5:45 on a Friday afternoon, by the way, in West Alabama. And I don't know. He goes, let's go. So we drive across the street and we walk in and no one's at the desk. Don't really hear a lot. We start knocking on the door and asking, is anybody back there? Anybody there? We did get in. We thought someone was there, right? We thought it might have been someone doing some cleanup. But it was the CEO of Marathon Equipment, Ed Fernari, that walked around the corner. He was the last one there, and he goes, what are you guys doing? And I said, well, we're making a cold call. And he started laughing, and he just said, come on back. Let's have a chat. And it was one of my best deals, and one that I still am proud of and talk about today.
Amazing. Does any of that still exist today? Do you still encourage some elements of that, or is it just?
It's so different, Ollie. I mean, I think if we did that today, we might get arrested. So it's not something that we do today.
Chris, a question that I have is there a trade-off between research and actually going out there and doing, right? Can you get stuck in the research phase or over prepare rather than actually go out and be proactive and make things happen? And what is that trade-off?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think it is something that younger reps struggle with because it's not something that they've done before, right? If that makes sense. Once you put it into practice, like I can look at a list of 10, 20 accounts. I can go through Crunchbase. I can go through SalesNav and ZoomInfo. I can go through intricately. I look at the job boards. I know exactly where I'm going. I can profile those accounts in, 10 minutes, right? But it's repetition, right? It's muscle memory. It's doing it over and over and over, where it's not just a practice, but it becomes a behavior. And Simon, I think you're right. It's just not something that people are used to doing. In many cases, it's not they haven't been trained, but they haven't really practiced it. And that's why it's something that we talk about on our team every single day. And in some cases, twice a day, whether it's one-on-ones, whether it's our team call on Monday, our forecast call on Thursday. So much of the conversation we have is around how to become efficient and effective in our top of funnel. If you understand your ICP, I think what I understood to be the second part of your question, if it's truly the ICP, right, there is never going to be a wasted effort in terms of doing that research. The only variable there in our SaaS world is the subscription renewal, as an example, right? Are they inside of 6 months? Are they, or do they have more than 6 months? There's a lot of things that we do and can do and other companies can do, right, to help with those last 3 months, whether it might be a month free, whether it might be a deferred payment. And companies are always evaluating. So if it's not a prospect for us today because of the renewal, they will be a prospect for us in 3 months. This world moves so fast, right? Like we used to have 9-month sales cycles, 10-year decisions. Now we have 1-year decisions and 9 months of work we have to collapse into 90 days. And that is another big difficulty, I think, for sellers today. Hell, it'd be difficult for me if I had to do that type of work today as a new person getting into this world, right? It's very difficult to be a SaaS seller today, in my opinion. And that's one of the reasons.
I was just about to jump in and just to give our viewers some visibility on your career, right? So 1997 to 2000, as Simon mentioned, you started as a territory sales rep, did that for 3 years at PTC, moved to Oracle, applications sales manager from 2000 to 2004, 2004 to 2006, Lawson Software. And this is a really interesting part. I think a lot of our viewers have obviously, know us for our Blade Logic story. Obviously, you went to Opsware, which was obviously a big Blade Logic competitor. As somebody on the other side and facing up against Opsware, tell us a little bit about that story. Tell us a little bit about the dynamics from the other side of the competition, let's say.
Yeah, for sure. I got involved with it. I worked with a guy by the name of Kino Helmy at PTC, right, for several years. He was a rep alongside the two of us at PTC when I got started, and he was the VP at Opsware. And Kino reached out. We'd been friends, stayed in touch. There was an opportunity to go to work for him, and that was the connection there, right? This is when server automation and the automation space was new and evolving. You mentioned Blade Logic. I had friends, obviously, that were at Blade Logic, and I also had some friends that were at Opsware. And a lot of similarities, Ollie, right? A lot of similarities in terms of the go-to-market, but maybe some of the presentation and the leadership styles were a little bit different. And I think for me personally, it was a great experience to see a different viewpoint. And what I mean by that, I mentioned earlier, John, very cerebral, understood the tech, spoke, didn't matter if he was speaking to an engineer or a CEO, he could articulate the value proposition in a very consumable way. Mark, on the other hand, also super smart, could do the same thing, but his style was more gregarious, right? He was a great motivator, right? And that was one of the things that I liked about working in that organization, because it was kind of bigger than life, right? The former, Netscape founders were there, right? Loud Cloud that evolved into Opsware, right? There was a lot there to get excited about, right? And, as far as I was concerned, I had a chance to beat Blade No Logic every single time we competed against them.
And this is a really interesting story. And for our viewers and listeners that may not necessarily be as familiar with the story, Chris is talking about John McMahon, who was the VP of Sales for Blade Logic, and Mark Cranny, who was the VP of Sales for Opsware at the time. And there was an interesting, whether it's healthy competition, but there's probably some, I don't know if there's any stories that you can share. I've heard of one story at the sales kickoff as an example.
Yeah, I think you might know more stories than me, but I don't know if everyone knows. Some people may have read Ben's book, but Ben's a big boxing fan and historian, right? Ben Horowitz, right? Yeah. And he was the CEO at Opsware at the time. And I believe this happened on more than one occasion, right? We had a big boxing ring brought into the sales kickoff, and Mark was the star of the show in boots, trunks, gloves. And from what I remember, he was a pretty good boxer. He demonstrated and carried himself very well in the ring.
And who was he boxing?
I think his name was John, but I don't really remember.
It was a great story, that one. So look, obviously furthering your career, 2006 to 2007 was, as we mentioned, at the Opsware, went through the HP acquisition, and then went from Mark Cranny over to John McMahon and bought into BMC in 2007. Tell us about you've obviously mentioned some of the subtleties in difference in, Mark and John, but is there anything else that you started to learn at BMC that's really helped you and shaped you in where you are today?
Yeah, I think this is where Ollie, that we started to see a lot more, I'll say, formalizing the playbook, documenting the playbook, right? John and Grant had started Force Management, and they had, again, created all of the trainings and the different documentation that we're all used to seeing today, right? The value framework, right? And John invested heavily in that training for us. And this is where a lot of those, where I experience all the concepts crystallized, right? So what did it really mean? We talked through all the definitions, not just of MEDPIC, what did the acronym stand for, but what would you do? What can you do? What activities could you put into practice to get the information to help you progress the deal? At the end of the day, it's about qualifying your time and deal progression. This is also something that I think sometimes people get a little bit hung up on. It's not a check in the box, right? It's not for me as a manager. It's not for, my boss, Matt, manager. This is for a rep, right? To hold themselves accountable. And I think when people start to leverage that internally in their business, again, that's an opportunity to be able to go from mediocre to be able to be great. BMC invested in their people. And this is where I saw an opportunity, and I started to see the differences. We had great training at PTC, but at BMC, everything had just evolved, right? And we would spend hours, and John would invest, take us out of the field. We would go and learn how to put the value framework into practice, right? And this is where another part of MEDDIC that's a little bit difficult for people is the metrics part, right? Right? I mean, if you think about, the value framework, right? It's as is and the negative consequences associated. It's, future state and the positive business outcomes. It's the required capabilities to bridge that gap. How do you measure success? How are we going to measure success? How are we going to show progress to the leadership team internally an organization that's going to invest in our solution? It was these types of exercises and this type of detail, frankly, that we learned, that we were trained on, that we put into practice, and that we were ultimately held accountable to. And I think at BMC is where a lot of people, started to see, obviously many of them had come from Blade Logic. Blade Logic was acquired. A lot of these people had been putting it into practice already. Many people from the PTC days. So it just became a culture of this is the best and really a proven way to not only be successful as an individual, but to be successful as a team and to be successful as a sales organization.
Chris, you talk a lot about the importance of leading indicators and accountability, and how that really does help you with account progression. Just talk to us a little bit about some of your kind of tenets of what leading indicators are most important and how you really manage that.
Yeah, I think some of that has also evolved over time, and I think it's become much more important. Again, like I said, in the SaaS world, right? Because things move so quickly. I think for me personally, we talk about 36, 24, 6, and 4. And that's 36 net new discos in a quarter. That's 24 product demonstrations in a quarter. That's a 60% conversion rate, which is not, maybe best in class, but is a reasonable expectation if we approach PG in the correct way and we're calling on the right ICP. It's 6, I'll say POC planning or trial planning or opportunities to have an EB go no conversation, and then 4 POCs all in a quarter. And those are challenging numbers in today's market, but those are numbers that over time have proven to be successful in the SaaS world. So that breaks down to 3 and 2 every week, 36, 24, right? So we look at previous week, we look at our 3 and 2, and we talk about the disposition, we talk about the outcomes, we plan for the discos that were converted, and we look at in the new week, what are the discos? Have we done the right prep, right? And, that's something that I, myself and the team, spend a lot of time on, because this puts us in a position. We always talk about sales execution, and you have to be great at it, but you have to have an opportunity to actually conduct a great sales campaign. And it all starts up front with PG. And are we doing the right things each and every day? New accounts to the funnel, new research, new contacts. Is it the right amount of outreach to make sure that we're hitting 3 and 2? Because 3 and 2 has been proven to put us in a position to be successful, not in the next 90 days, but the 180, right? And that's what we want to look at, is a 6-month rolling forecast.
Amazing. Obviously, you speak about accountability, and I think, again, as we're fortunate enough to have you on the show, back in your days, you mentioned at the beginning, if you were running a 90-day contract, right? If you didn't do it, you were out. How are you now as a modern day leader helping to drive that accountability, and what is it, and what are some of the techniques you use to drive that accountability across those metrics?
Right. One, it's just share. A lot of it is to do with transparency. I just, and that seems like a little bit of a cliche, but, and it is in many ways, but also very hard to put into practice in a lot of situations, right? And what I mean by that is I'm always showing my dashboards as an example. And again, sometimes that can have a negative connotation. It's not meant as a manager sitting across the desk from a rep, right? Especially in the Zoom world. It's more about, hey, we're on the same page, looking at our activity, right? Looking where we have been successful in our conversions, looking at where we have not been successful, talking about why, where did we potentially make a mistake, right? Was it the wrong person, right? Was it the wrong title? Did we make a mistake in the research from a tech fit perspective? But it's always talking about outcomes, right? I feel like today that's an easier way, or a more consumable way for reps to understand and to grow and to learn. And it takes a lot of time, right, to do that, to spend that time. I speak to my team every day, multiple times by phone, Slack, and text, not because I'm checking up on them, but are we putting into practice the lessons that we have learned, the things where we may have had shortcomings? Are we filling those potential gaps, right? And I think what that does is, especially when we're distant and we're spread out, reps need to feel like you support them. Again, a little bit of a cliche, but it's not about the words, it's about the actions, right? Does the leader spend enough time to dig into that rep's business? Not from an oversight perspective, but being able to articulate why you're doing this, and the why is, I want to help you get better. I want to help you get better at your craft, right? I want you to be successful. And again, a lot of cliches, I haven't seen it, unfortunately, put into practice enough by sales leaders. And frankly, it's one of the reasons I still do this today, right? I mean, do I think about going on the golf course? Yes. But do I get a lot of satisfaction today helping people be successful early in their career? Absolutely. And ultimately, this is one thing I want to convey here. Accountability ultimately should be the individual, if that makes sense, right? I want to be responsible for them as individual contributors, and as a team, I want them to hold themselves accountable, right? And I think sometimes it's nuanced there. I can kick someone's ass all day long and put whatever numbers I want in front of them to demonstrate shortcomings. But it's different to put them in a position to understand where they have areas of improvement and show them how to to get to where they want to be, and them holding themselves accountable to get there. It's a different dynamic. And I feel like that's where sales leaders, first line sales leaders, can have the most impact. One of the areas where they can have the most impact to their team.
That's great insight, and really kind of it's really kind of good to hear your perspective of how you really kind of manage and really your style, and I think that's someone that's been part of this community for a relatively long time, from kind of an old school to see how you're really embracing the differences and the different approaches which are required for modern selling. I think it's really, really profound in itself. Just going back to some of the kind of the fundamentals of Medic, you really do focus your efforts on some. You obviously believe in all of Medic, but what are the key parts of Medic that you think are most important, or even more non-negotiable than others, if that's fair to say?
Pain and champion. Identify pain and champion, I and C. It's not that it's not all important, but if you think about the acronym itself, some of it is a little more downstream, right? Early on, top of funnel. Pain and champion is where we put ourselves in the potentially the best situation to be successful. And if you think about pain, right, I think there might be some questions. Some people may have a different feeling on which one comes first. Personally, it's pain, right? John Kaplan used to say, no business issue, no business. And I still remember that today, right? And if you think about what, he's absolutely right? Where is the pain? Usually it manifests technically first, because we're selling a technical, complex product. People that are really good at what they do understand how to link that technical pain to a negative consequence, a negative impact on the business. That's higher level stuff that's not easy to do, and people need guidance, right? People need sales leaders to help them through that. So I am of the opinion that pain is the most important thing. Again, not rocket science. I think, and then who is impacted by that pain? Who is the person negatively impacted by that pain at multiple levels, right? Because we need multiple champions in an account. Very difficult to do. You got to identify the person, right? The person impacted by that pain. You have to develop them, right? And you have to test them, which is also very difficult for young sellers to do sometimes, because they might be dealing with someone that might be a little bit further along in their career, right? And have they built that credibility? Can they test? And then the last piece that I learned probably too late in my career is use them, right? You don't want to spend all of that time identifying and building and testing, not to use them when the time is right. Use them to understand the paper process. Use them to not only understand the criteria, but shape it, right? Understand the buying process, right? It's like once you have that champion, use that individual to ultimately a mutual benefit.
Are there any common challenges around champion building or champion identification that you kind of see?
I think in our world today, in many cases, it does start kind of at a grassroots level. I think, and if you think about that individual, that person, in many cases, they're not in an office anymore. It's not that we're not able to go and see them the way that we may have been able to do in the past, right? A lot of these organizations have downsized. These people are working a lot more hours, right? And probably for not more money, and they've seen, maybe peers, come and go in an organization. I think from a champion perspective, as sellers, we have to understand not just the persona, but a little bit about the person and what they're going through in their job, in their role, in their function. It's not just about us making a pitch. It's like, can we be a touch empathetic to the person that we're speaking to? And do we have an opportunity to make a connection with them in that way? I think that is where, because it is challenging, Simon, right? These people aren't naturally, I'll say sometimes willing to go and represent a vendor inside their organization. But when you're able to make that connection, that's gold. That's where you can start to build. But I think it starts with really understanding, the challenges. It goes back to the PG earlier about the research, about the tech, about the fit, right? About your hypothesis. Do you understand the role and the challenges of the role that person has every day, and how that potentially impacts them personally, right? Family, right? Things like that. I know this might be a little bit different, but these are the things that put you in a position to identify a person and then build them up in the world that we're in today of SaaS, quick moving, fast decisions, right? Zoom. I think we all struggle with that sometimes. And I think being a touch empathetic and understanding your buyer is the best way to do that.
Incredible, Chris. So going back to your career and I suppose your career development, you left BMC 2007 to 2011, and you took a very different path. You didn't, necessarily follow many of the leaders, or you may have done, maybe misunderstood here. But obviously, you joined Cisco as an organization. What was the reason for that move, Chris?
No, I think that's a good question. I joke sometimes, and it is a joke because I had great experiences there. I've had the dubious honor of being acquired by Cisco twice, right? Once was through Tidal Software, and then the second time was through AppDynamics. So I started out at a smaller, more of a startup type organization. Like I said, the first time with Tidal, the second time with AppDynamics, that ultimately were both acquired. The first time I was acquired almost immediately and ended up staying at Cisco for almost 5 years. The second time, I stayed for a little bit, and then I thought that it was time to move on. Cisco is a very different type of organization, but I think for me personally, it was an opportunity. And what I mean by that is, that was the first time. It was very early when Cisco was experimenting with being a software company. Now you see the earnings and you see anything about Cisco, it's just their software. At the time, they were totally a hardware company. We were a real small, incubated, I'll say well-funded startup inside of an organization like Cisco. And for me, that was the challenge, right? And it was like, how could we build a software company, in this case, our investor was Cisco instead of a VC or a PE firm. And it was a challenge for me and it was an opportunity for me to build an organization, to hire an organization, to train an organization and enable one, and ultimately one that became successful, over $100 million run rate. And then it became was no longer in incubation, right? It was kind of mainstream inside of the Cisco world. Had opportunity to be a first, second, and third line leader, and I learned a lot. And one of the things that helped that I didn't really realize was something that I would leverage later on. It was like how to operate in a highly matrixed and large organization with different functions and different BUs that sometimes worked together and sometimes competed. But for me, it was a great experience and one that I learned a lot from.
So obviously moving on from Cisco, joined as a vice president of sales for Yota, 2015, 2016, before being called upon at AppDynamics in 2016. Talk to us about that move and that transition there.
Yeah, well, I think at Yota there was an opportunity for me to go back and work, within the network. And what I mean by that, Vic Vishnavi, former CMO at BladeLogic and then at BMC, was the CEO at Yota, and John was on the board. And that was really the opportunity for me. There was a change. There was I'll say a change in direction and at Yota, and I ended up staying on. And Richard, CEO today, great guy, great professional. But the opportunity to go back and work within the community at AppDynamics and at that time where AppDynamics was an easy decision for me.
Amazing. And so obviously AppDynamics, you were there 2016, 2019, which you'd obviously been 4-5 years, within the Cisco incubation, going back to, the team. How did the playbook evolve in that period of time? What did you see transition in those 4 or 5 years? Because that's quite a big inception point of,
I think this is where we started to see, Ollie, people that were in the community early on sort of make some tweaks, right? We all hear the value pyramid we've all heard the value pyramid. Now this was more BMC, but that's another example of how, things evolved and things became more documented, right? All around understanding the organization that you're calling on and demonstrating to the buyer that we understand not just your business, but the potential challenges associated with your business, right? And then when we got to AppDynamics, that next evolution, right, the 3 whys, right? That's where we started to hear, that terminology. Why anything? Why AppDynamics? Why now, right? It's just that evolution of being more prescriptive, with the playbook, right? It became, this is where we started to see the evolution of cloud, started to see the evolution of subscription, revenue, right? It was about not just why would they buy, but when are they going to buy, right? We need to understand the timing associated. So this is, that is something that I saw evolve and become more formalized and something that we still use today.
Incredible. And so obviously AppDynamics obviously you're taken on as a regional director at that point, stepping into your first management role within the Playbook community. How were you able to use your learnings and use all the skills that you've learned through your past to really now start to apply yourself as a leader?
Yeah, probably not uncommon from other individuals that you've spoken to, Ollie. I tried to look back at this is going to come off the wrong way. Who were my best sales leaders, right? And what was it that I liked about them? And at the same time, who were the ones that I thought maybe weren't where they should have been, and what did I not like about that, right? And really looking backwards, in my career about, where was I most successful and why? Where was the team most successful and why? And really started to try and understand that. And that helped me kind of formalize and conceptualize for myself the kind of leader I wanted to be. And what that was hands-on, right? Kaplan used to use the term two-sided discovery, right? Sitting on the same side of the table. And it really applies as a sales leader. Are you side by side or are you across the table? And, that's a little bit over the top, but I'm trying to convey the point, right? I want someone that's going to build me up. I wanted someone that was going to build me up, and I wanted to be the kind of leader that was going to build the team up, right? Knowing that I was going to have their back, knowing that I wasn't going to ask them to do anything that I wasn't, one, willing to do, but also very capable of doing. And, doing sales calls, making PG calls, executing demonstration and product calls, handling the EB meeting. I wanted to show them how to do things the right way instead of just kind of telling them, so to speak. But in putting myself in a position to show them, I also had to hold myself accountable that I did it the right way, right? Because naturally you're looking to your sales leader for guidance on what's the best way to do it, right? What's the right way to do it, right? What's best in class, right? Whatever term that you want to use. So it made me hold myself to a higher standard because I wanted to be the person that could do it the right way.
Incredible. So moving on from there, obviously you had 3 years, very successful career at AppDynamics, then moved on to Xenos as the head of North America, then on to Lacework. And not to skip out those two big chunks, but I think, I'd be really, really keen to really talk about today and to where you are at Coralogix and the mission and why Coralogix and really the mission you're on at the moment.
Yeah. Well, I think it's pretty apparent I've always been in, I'll say, the monitoring space, right? I still call it monitoring for because it's just ingrained in my head, right? But the evolution of it, it's a must-have. Right. Lacework was a great organization. Again, got to go work for members, in the community and for people that you've had on the show. Right. And, but for me, that is something that I've been around. It's a tech and an ecosystem that I understand, very well. And, even though traditionally, it's a must have, some people could say it's a commodity. Right. And I think that question and understanding how Coralogix is different was something that I needed to find out when the opportunity was presented to me, and the more and more research I did about it, not just the tech itself, but how it evolved, the founders associated, right? You could tell really quickly that there was differentiation. And in the market that's been around for several decades, right, and tech that's been around for at least that monitoring has been around for several decades, right, what was different about Coralogix that was going to allow me to not just represent, but represent with confidence, right? Bells and whistles, features, functions, they're all about the same. How are you going to differentiate? It is with the architecture. It is with the platform. And that truly is how Coralogix is different, right? And the things that architecture allows us to provide to our customers.
Help us understand that, because I think you're on to a really, 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 I think, interesting subject, because as recruiters by day, podcasters by night, we've obviously seen the evolution of the observability space, starting with your legacy platforms from the AppDynamics and the Splunks to now, your modern day, where we're seeing, lots and lots of vendors coming up, Grafana Labs, Observing, you guys. How are you? What are your key differentiators, and what does separate you from your competition?
Sure. Well, I think I'll try to be as brief as I can on that with conveying the message. Right. Some of it is about being a young company. Ollie, right? Shipping product, really in 2017, a relatively young company. But what does that allow us to do? That has allowed us to leverage the most modern tech in actually building the platform. What I mean by that, right? It's Kubernetes inside of AWS, right? There's RocksDB and Kafka Streams built on top of that cluster. That is all part of the architecture, super modern, right? Taking advantage of not just modern tech, but some of the most modern open source products. Our organization, is probably some of the biggest contributors to many of the open source projects, OTel, Open Telemetry being one of them, right? So modern tech that people understand and want to be associated with, number one. But what does that allow us to do, Ollie? What is the benefit to the customers, right? If you think about how everything is done today by every other vendor, they ingest data, telemetry data, logs, metrics, traces, security data. They ingest that data, and then they have to index it, meaning they have to make a copy of that, transport it to their cloud, into their data store, then analyze it, and then ship results back to the customer. There's latency, right? There's scale issues, and more importantly today, with the evolution of the cloud, expense issues. And what I mean by that, the cloud, the data volumes are growing faster than most revenue streams, right? And the way the cost models are set up for many of the competitors, that 10x data spike results in unpredictable costs, overages each and every month as companies continue to roll out product into their clouds. So what we're able to do, what's different, is we don't have to index any of that data. We have a data pipeline called Streama. That's what the product is called. That's the data pipeline. We ingest and analyze in stream in the customer environment, store data in their cloud storage if they're in AWS, S3. We analyze real-time alerting, real-time anomaly detection right inside of the customer's cloud without having to index. Super fast, super performant, very cost efficient, in many cases 30, 40, even 50% less than the incumbent, right? And that's really our value proposition. And that's what is resonating with many people today, because they have seen the problem that legacy architectures present them from an observability perspective, in their clouds.
Right.
And and not to over talk about this, because I think it's a really interesting subject, and we talk about it a lot. And I think as an organization, obviously that cost saving is fantastic for the customer, and obviously as an organization you have significant cost savings. But I think you're doing something exceptional as well when it comes to how you're reinvesting that money. Can you tell us a little bit more around that reinvestment of money and where that's going?
Yeah, it's a great question. That's also something that's very unique to Coralogix. It's our support model. And I even hate to use the term support. I'll say it's our services model. And what I mean by that, our costs are lower because we're not indexing. You think about other vendors, one of their most significant expenses are their cloud expense. That's not the situation for us, right? Yes, we do pass some of that savings on to our customers, but we also invest that money into our services organization. And what do I mean by that, right? 24/7 in-app chat support with a level 3 DevOps engineer. I mean, that is readily available in any screen within the platform. We're contractually obligated to respond to our customers within 2 minutes. Right now, it's less than 30 seconds. They'll have a live person willing to get on a Zoom chat, Teams chat, WebEx chat with the customer and work out their issue. We don't have all these tickets, so to speak, right? It is all live. Our mean time to resolution right now is less than 60 minutes across all of our issues, over 2,500 customers. That doesn't exist in the market anywhere and is extremely unique. And it's one of the reasons why once we get involved in a cycle with the customer and we demonstrate that to them live in a POC, they're blown away. It's not only support. It is not an extra cost. It is part of the subscription. So not only are they getting that 24/7, 365 support, also with the organization, they get onboarding services, they get deployment services, they get enablement services, migration services. We move customers off incumbents. We're not going into greenfield. They have 100, 1,000 dashboards. We migrate all of them into our platform on behalf of the customer, and it's not an additional cost. It's part of the subscription. And that support and that manner of it stays with the customer for the lifetime of their customer of Coralogix. Very differentiated.
Yeah, it's a great story, as I said, and having been fortunate enough to work with you, Chris, I think when you start to look at the team that you're building, you can see some of the most formidable sales reps obviously joining you. So I just want to wish you continued success and good luck in the future when it comes to building Coralogix, because I think there's obviously a great future ahead of you there.
Totally believe in what we're doing. It's a great situation, it's a great company, and it's a great time to join.
Amazing.
Great. So I think this is the time. I think this is the perfect time, Chris, to really reflect on what we've spoken about today and what we've really heard. And I personally have really enjoyed the conversation today, Chris, because I think it's really given us a great insight into how the playbook has really evolved from the old chest beating days of the PTC days, right to the kind of the modern day. And I think what's really interesting is that the actual playbook itself hasn't changed so much, because actually at the core of it is a mindset, and whether the actual way it's being executed is being interpreted and kind of bent into different directions to accommodate the demands of customers and the demands of the sellers. The actual mindset actually really still is the same mindset. It's still about qualification. It's still about bringing value. It's still about putting yourself in the shoes of your customer, really understanding their pains and really being able to kind of formalize a scientific approach to selling to enhance the predictability of results. And I think it's been really great spending this time with you today. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us, and I'm absolutely certain that many of our viewers and our listeners have taken so much from this session today. So thank you so much for spending this time with us today.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Ali. I really enjoyed it, and I really appreciate the opportunity. It's been great to get to know both of you, and it was awesome to meet you when I was over in London, and I look forward to working with you.
Absolutely. Chris, you're an amazing guy. You're a wicked person to work with. So really do appreciate your time, and thank you so much for sharing in such great wisdom. So to all our listeners, thank you so much for joining us today. Please do subscribe to our various channels, iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube. All the links are in the description below. But thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you've enjoyed this session.